Hello and welcome back to the 5th episode in the Building a Smart Home Cheaply series. If you're just now joining us, today we're going to be focusing on how to get Home Assistant accessible remotely. At this point in the series, it's assumed that you now know what smart home automations are, what Home Assistant is, what it brings to the table, you've installed it, you've set it up, and now you're interested in how to access it when you are not on your home network, whether that's through your phone or through a laptop when you're at the coffee shop. Also, apologies in advance. I was kind of tired when I first recorded this video, so my tonality might be a little bit off, but the information is solid, so hopefully that's the key takeaway here from this video. As of today, there are two ways to access Home Assistant remotely. One way is super straightforward, but it does have a subscription cost. That money goes towards the developers of Home Assistant. If that's something you want to support, and you just want to save yourself some technical work, I recommend doing option 1, which I'll touch on in just a second. Now, if you're interested in option 2, it involves port forwarding, it requires having access to your router settings, and just has a little bit more legwork involved. We're going to start with option 1, which is the subscription model, where it sets everything up for you, and we'll touch on option 2 later in the video. Use the scrub bar below to skip to the section that you want to watch. At the end of this video, we're going to all still be on that same page for the future videos to come. This video has a little bit of length to it. That's mostly because of option number 2, and it's also because I thought it was important that you understood what it was that you were doing during option number 2. I think a lot of tutorials currently gloss over port forwarding and what's going on, and I think it's important that you understand what it is that you're doing, especially when it involves opening up your network to external traffic. That being said, I am going to break this video down into segments, again using the scrub bar. So if you have a little bit more of a technical background, you can use the timestamps in the description or that scrub bar to skip to the parts that you find most relevant.
Yesterday.
The first free way is very simple. You just log into your Home Assistant, you go to configuration, you click on Home Assistant Cloud at the top, and you can start your free 1-month trial by clicking here. Essentially, you'll just create an account through Nabucasa, which is their partner cloud service, and you'll start your free trial, and they will generate this URL for you to use, which you can use to plug into their mobile app to access Home Assistant remotely, or just to use when you're on the go on your laptop to access Home Assistant remotely. The advantage to this is that it's very straightforward and it saves you a little bit of technical work. Essentially what I'm saying is if you're willing to pay that subscription model, you're already done with this video, because once you follow the instructions on this page and get your account set up and linked up, you're going to be done. But for people who want to cut costs or get technical with this, let's get started. All right, before we just jump into the configuration, I do kind of want to explain what we're going to do here. Port forwarding is essentially allowing external traffic, people that aren't in your local network, to access your local network. And if that sounds scary, it probably should a little bit. Using ports, you can direct traffic to certain services on your local network, a service being something like Home Assistant. You probably noticed that when we were accessing Home Assistant, not only did you have to type in the IP address of it, but you also had to type in 8123 after that IP address, and that is the port that Home Assistant runs on. Web traffic often runs on ports 80 and 443 by default, so if I were to go to graysonadams.com:80, you'll see that it just takes me to my website, because 80 is implied when you're typing in a website domain. Your browser is essentially automatically putting a :80. Okay, so what about port 443? Port 443 is for secure encrypted traffic, which is going to be the majority of how you browse the web these days. When accessing through port 443, you're using some sort of certificate, which validates that the domain that you're visiting is actually the domain that you're visiting and it's trusted. And that's why you get this little lock icon next to domains that you visit like google.com or facebook.com. And if you click show certificate on your browser, you'll be able to follow the chain of certificates that basically validates that this website is trustworthy. What we're going to be doing is setting up our own certificate chain for our external Home Assistant URL. Normally this would be a pretty convoluted process, but Home Assistant holds our hand a little bit during this. What is important though is that you have the ability to log into your router so that we can set up the port forwarding, and also so that you can make sure that your Home Assistant private IP address doesn't change. Now again, if all this sounds way too much and you're just like, forget this, I'm done, I don't want to do Home Assistant anymore, there is that first option, and it does have a free trial, and that will do everything that we're about to do here with the click of a button. Okay, first thing you're going to want to do, go to your router. Obviously your router's interface is going to look probably different from mine, but the concept is still there. What we're going to be doing is port forwarding to Home Assistant. So you're going to want to look up the instructions for your model router on how to port forward. If you want to poke around instead of Googling, it's probably under Settings Advanced, or it's probably under Firewall, or it might be under a section that just straight up says Port Forwarding. Once you're there, you're going to create this port forwarding rule. And if it lets you name it, just call it Home Assistant. And you're going to port forward from external port 8123 to the local IP address of Home Assistant, which you already know because that's what you use to access the UI. So in my case, it's 192.168.1.51. So we're going to be forwarding from your external IP address on port 8123 down into the local IP address of Home Assistant over port 8123. Go ahead and apply your rule, let your router reboot or let the settings take effect, and then we're going to verify that this worked. Okay, to verify that this worked, you have a public IP address. To find out what that is, just go to Google and search, "What is my IP?" Copy the IP address that comes up, open a new tab, paste it in, and just like how you access your local Home Assistant over port 8123, you're going to use your public IP address and add a :8123, and then press enter. Okay, so now it looks like I can access Home Assistant through my public IP address over port 8123. Obviously, we're not going to want to have to remember our public IP address every single time we want to access Home Assistant. And then there's also the case that some internet service providers will rotate your IP address and it will just change sometimes, which means that the URL that you're currently accessing won't work at some point. There's a service called DuckDNS, which is free, which lets you have a static domain name that points to your public IP address. That means that you can just type out a domain name and press enter, and it will automatically route to your public IP address. The nice thing about DuckDNS is that through an integration with Home Assistant will notify DuckDNS when your public IP address changes so that your domain name points to the new IP address automatically. That way you can always access Home Assistant through a domain name and you don't need to know your public IP address anymore. To get set up, you're going to want to go to duckdns.org and you're going to want to make an account. When logged into DuckDNS, you're going to see a page like this. You're going to see a token right here, and that's going to be important because that's what Home Assistant is going to use to communicate with DuckDNS. Think of this like a password, and you don't want to share this. You might be laughing because I'm sharing mine. I'm going to recycle my token after this video, so it's no longer valid. The first thing you're going to want to do, though, is that you'll see here in the bottom, there's a domains section, and you can actually create your own domain that's hosted at duckdns.org. Now, if you're thinking, I'm just going to make this some sort of garbled up domain name that nobody can guess, that's not a good way of securing something. We're going to rely on Home Assistant security to protect us from people logging in. So just make it something that you're going to remember. I'm just going to make mine graysonadams.duckdns.org. Once it's created, DuckDNS will actually automatically put in your current IP address and tie it to that domain, which is fine. But again, your public IP address can and probably will change. So there's a little bit more work we need to do here. Go ahead and copy the token that's at the top of your page and go back to Home Assistant. In the previous video, we covered that there's something called add-ons for Home Assistant, which extend the functionality of Home Assistant, adding additional features that you may or may not use. There are a couple of add-ons that we want to install at this point to get set up with DuckDNS. Go ahead and go to your Supervisor tab and go on to the add-on store. Look for DuckDNS in the top under Official Add-ons or use the search bar at the top. Go ahead and press Install. Go to the Configuration tab at the top, and for your domains, you're going to want to type in the full domain that you just created. So not just, in my case, Grayson Adams, but graysonadams.duckdns.org. Replace the null text for token with the actual token from DuckDNS. And then for Let's Encrypt, you're going to put accept terms to true, making sure that you actually read their terms, which I know you will. And to briefly overview, Let's Encrypt is what will actually generate the certificate that lets your browser verify that this is in fact your DuckDNS domain and that it is actually you that is hosting it. Basically, that's going to give us that little lock icon on your browser, and that way your browser won't freak out and think that this isn't a trustworthy website. When we use a certificate, we're going to actually be accessing over HTTPS instead of HTTP, And the advantage of that is that your data is now encrypted. And so if somebody were to try to intercept your traffic, they would have encrypted data instead of the raw data, which is pretty important when we're accessing something like our smart home software. So once you've put accept terms to true, and you've put in your token and your domain, go ahead and press save. Now I want to try something. So let's go back to DuckDNS and let's replace the current IP field, which was automatically populated correctly, to something incorrect. Let's make it 123.123.123.123, and let's press update. Okay, so now graysonadams.duckdns.org is pointed to another IP address and not my home network. That means that if we were to try to go there, we'd be routed to something else. Basically, I want to test to make sure that our DuckDNS add-on on Home Assistant is actually working. So let's go back to Home Assistant, go back to the Info tab, and press Start or Restart. Go to the Log tab, press refresh, and you'll see that it's actively working on generating those certificates. This will not work if Home Assistant cannot be accessed remotely. So make sure that your port forwarding is set up correctly and that you could access it through your browser over your public IP address. Otherwise, this step will fail. If I press refresh one more time, we'll see that the test passed and that it was able to validate and create the certificates. Let's go back to DuckDNS and refresh the page. We'll see that DuckDNS updated the IP address to be my public IP address again, which means that the communication between Home Assistant and DuckDNS is working. So let's try going to the DuckDNS URL. Now, if you set up your port forwarding to forward over port 8123, make sure you put in that port, :8123 after your DuckDNS domain name, and press enter. Cool. So now we're actually accessing Home Assistant over DuckDNS. But you'll notice something. Your browser might say that it's not secure. But we generated our certificates, so why is it saying that? We need to tell Home Assistant to now use those certificates. So to do that, let's go back to Home Assistant. Let's go to Supervisor, go to the add-on store, and install the file editor. Enable the Show in Sidebar option and press Start. You'll now see in your sidebar, File Editor. So go to that. Click the folder icon in the top left to go to the file browser, and click on configuration.yaml. In your configuration file, beneath default config, we're going to press enter twice. This is going to be plain English. This isn't coding, so don't be intimidated. We're just creating a configuration file. We're going to create a section in our configuration file for the HTTP settings for Home Assistant. So we're going to write HTTP : and we're going to press enter. Go to the settings wheel in the top right. Go to editor settings, scroll down, and set your tab size from 4 to 2. Scroll down to the bottom and press Save Settings Locally. Press the Tab key, and you'll see that it created 2 spaces instead of 4. You could have also just pressed the spacebar twice, but this will save us a little bit of time while we're writing. We're going to type SSL_certificate : space, and we're going to do a slash SSL/fullchain.pem, and then press enter. We're telling Home Assistant the path where our certificates are stored. On the next line, also indented, we're going to put SSL_key : /SSL/priv key.pem. Press the save icon in the top right. Go to your configuration tab on the left. Scroll down to server controls and press restart. You should immediately see connection lost in the bottom left corner, reconnecting. If you don't see that, there's a chance that there is an error in the file that you just edited. To fix that, you'll want to go to the logs tab at the top. I can't access that because I'm currently rebooting. You'll see the logs and it should tell you at the very top the latest error, and it should explain what the misconfiguration is. But if you see connection lost, it means it accepted the changes and it's restarting Home Assistant. While it's rebooting, I should emphasize something. When you set up your port forwarding, you'll remember that you typed in your local IP address for Home Assistant. Well, there's a chance that your local IP address will also change, and it was dynamically assigned to Home Assistant. So if Home Assistant were to go offline from your network, like be unplugged or disconnect from your Wi-Fi and get reconnected, that local IP address could also change. Go ahead and Google for your router model how to set a fixed private IP address. You'll often find that under a setting called IP allocation settings for your router. Basically, you're just going to want to make sure that that IP address does not change and that it is fixed. Okay, so let's access Home Assistant again. Uh-oh. Looks like we can't access it anymore. And it was all part of my evil plan to lock you out of Home Assistant. I'm kidding. Basically, because we told Home Assistant to use HTTPS and use certificates, we can no longer access Home Assistant over HTTP. So, in your URL bar, make sure that you're putting https://. Now I'm going to emphasize that I'm currently still accessing Home Assistant through the local IP address. I'm not accessing it through DuckDNS currently. When I do this on Safari, I'm able to access the login page. On Safari, I'm noticing some weird issues, like I'm seeing initializing, but nothing's happening. This is actually an issue with Safari. Basically, the certificate that we've assigned to Home Assistant is telling your browser to expect it to be your DuckDNS URL. So basically, Safari is going, wait, this URL is 192.168 or whatever. This isn't your DuckDNS URL. So Safari is trying to protect you right now, and it's saying, we're not going to keep loading stuff because we can't verify the identity anymore. Chrome, on the other hand, will ask us, hey, do you want to trust this certificate, even though we can't validate it? So let's switch over to Chrome. Let's go to the local IP address of Home Assistant again, but we're going to use HTTPS. Now Google will say our connection is not private because this certificate is not valid. Go to Advanced and go ahead and proceed. Now we can access Home Assistant and we can log in. Okay, so we can still access Home Assistant locally. If we click on the not secure in Chrome, we'll see that it says it can't validate the certificate. And if we click on the certificate itself, we'll see that it's trying to use the certificates that we had just created. And we'll see that those are assigned to our DuckDNS URL, which is why, because your local URL does not match up with your DuckDNS domain, we're getting this issue. So let's try accessing it over the DuckDNS URL. Make sure to include your port, and then also make sure to put HTTPS. All right, cool, it loaded. So now we're accessing Home Assistant externally through DuckDNS, and it's secured with a certificate. I can now log in with no issues, and if I click on the lock in the top left and I go to certificate, it's valid. All right, thank you so much for watching. At this point, we now have Home Assistant accessible remotely and through a secure URL, regardless of which option you went with. In our next video, we're going to be going over how to access Home Assistant through the smartphone app for iOS. There's some cool benefits to that, like getting additional data points into Home Assistant, information like your phone's location, the battery percentage of your phone, whether or not it's charging, and other cool bits and pieces of information that you can use in your automations. Obviously, with location being a pretty big one. Make sure to subscribe if you're interested in this series and in the next videos to come, or if you might be interested in other related content that I'll be putting out on my channel. See you in the next one.